Welcome everybody to Transportation Levy 101 with Seattle Neighborhood Greenways. We are very excited to have you here. This is going to be kind of a kind of high-level overview, and then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what's happening now and how you can get involved. If you just noticed that we did start a recording, so if you don't want to be recorded, make sure that you have your video off. Yeah, so I'll just start with some quick introductions. My name is Clara Cantor. I'm a community organizer with Seattle Neighborhood Greenways. And I'll pass it on to Gordon in just a moment. If you in the audience can introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be wonderful. Just share your name, maybe what neighborhood you're calling in from, or what neighborhood you're most interested in, and maybe one thing that interests you about this subject. What brought you here tonight? And while folks are doing that in the chat, Gordon, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Gordon Padelford, he, him pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Seattle Neighborhood Greenways.
And I'm seeing people start to introduce themselves in the chat. Thank you all for being here and spending your Tuesday night with us. So just start with a quick overview. Seattle Neighborhood Greenways is a grassroots advocacy organization here in Seattle. We've been around for a little over 10 years now, and we advocate primarily for people walking and rolling and biking and accessing transit in every neighborhood in Seattle. We have a grassroots structure of volunteers that really direct our organizational priorities and what we're working on. And this year, the Transportation Levy is one of our biggest campaigns. So we're here to talk about it a little bit. Over the course of this hour, I'm going to do this kind of broad level overview. Gordon will jump in with a little bit of history, how we got here, the previous levy, the existing levy, and how that kind of sets us the stage for where we are now. And then I'll jump in with the what's happening now and what SDOT is doing, what we as advocates are doing, and how you can get involved and influence that. Then we'll have a question and answer at the end. We will be trying our best to monitor the chat while it's going. But if we miss something, please re-ask those questions at the end so that we don't miss any of those. Hopefully we'll get to everyone. And I'm seeing you all introduce yourselves there now. That's a little distracting, actually. And welcome. So, general overview. Like I mentioned before, one of our biggest priorities this year is advocating for a transportation levy that really aligns with our values and funds the projects that are going to move our city closer to those values, making it easier for people to get where they need to go, walking and rolling and biking and riding transit, making transportation in our city safer and more equitable and more sustainable, and making our city safer and more equitable and more sustainable. Our transportation levy structure in Seattle. A little bit of taxation background first. Washington State really has very limited ways that we can tax ourselves. Seattle in particular is one of the most regressive tax structures in the country. We're kind of stuck in this sales tax and property tax framework because we as a state don't have an income tax. A little bit of side eye, but then Tim Eyman came along and made it worse by capping the property taxes, which requires cities to have to go to voters every so many years to raise property taxes in order to fund the things that we need as a city, like transportation. When I'm talking about tax structures, regressive basically means that wealthy people are paying a significantly lower tax rate than poorer people in terms of like the percentage of their income or their wealth. So taxes like an income tax or capital gains tax are what we would call progressive because wealthier people pay more, which is what we want to be happening. And property taxes are generally not great because, although owners of expensive houses do pay a little bit more, it's not really proportional, and landlords often pass those taxes straight on to renters. That being said, it's not as regressive as, say, like a sales tax. So you hear sometimes in the media people talking about property tax burdens, and in Washington State, I just want to point out the map that we have on the screen here. It says how high are property taxes in your state, and there's a map of the U.S. Showing that Washington State is, oh, I can't even read that. That's very small.
We're number 29.
Say it again.
Number 29. Is there a way I can make this screen bigger if it's
No, I just have a small screen on my laptop and
oh,
poor eyesight. So this map is showing that comparably to other states in the US, our property taxes are not as high as many other places. We recognize that a property tax is not really an ideal way of how we want to be funding our city, but it's what we're working with within the framework right now. So what does this levy fund? Seattle's transportation levy currently funds about 30% of the city's transportation budget, which is pretty high, all things considered. The levy is used exclusively on capital projects, which is everything from big street redesign projects to pedestrian bridges to sidewalks, bike lanes, street crossings, maintenance, all the way down to like very, very tiny, minute spot improvement kinds of things. When we say it's for capital projects, that means that it can't be used for transit service, for example, which is a huge part of our transportation system. And I do want to share this in the chat. If you're curious about what kinds of things the current levy funds, the city of Seattle has a Move Seattle Levy dashboard, just for like people who really want to get in the weeds and have a look at that. It's interesting. It's really interesting to look at. The Move Seattle Levy was approved by voters 9 years ago in 2015. And 2024 is the last of those 9 years. And so we're at the end of the cycle. It's expiring. And the conversation right now is about what we're going to do to replace it. The slide that we're looking at right now says the levy is 20 to 30% of SDOT's budget. Right now, as of last budget year, it's closer to 30%. And this shows the Move Seattle Levy fund about 105 million annually compared to local and other funding, which is 421 million, and then other kinds of funding sources down below that. And I'm going to pass it to Gordon to talk a little bit about history.
Yeah, thanks, Clara. So before the Move Seattle levy, there was a previous transportation levy in Seattle called Bridging the Gap, which some of you may remember. It was being formulated right as I was graduating from high school, so I can't say that I was really paying attention to it. And some of you in the chat may have more of a history of it and can share more with folks than I can. But it, like Clara mentioned, it sort of came out of this need to go to the voters for property tax increases because Tim Eyman had capped the amount that the city was able to raise on its own. And this levy was really focused on maintenance. And the way it was set up is that they said basically 2/3 of it needs to go to maintenance, and then 1/3 of it can go to transit and walking and biking. One of the other features of it is it didn't have a lot of flexibility. They really wanted it to be going to those categories, and the Levy Oversight Committee, which was a group of citizens and stakeholders that were looking at this, one of their recommendations for the next levy was to have more flexibility in that. There was some flexibility, but this was the era of If you remember, if you bike in Seattle, this was when sharrows were a big deal. And so they had a bucket of money and they said, this will go towards sharrows and bike lanes. And it was all sort of grouped together. And that turned out to be problematic because it meant they built a lot of miles of just painting a bike symbol on the road, for instance. But overall, it moved Seattle forward in some major ways, and we took some lessons forward to the next levy, which is, the Move Seattle Levy. Was another 9-year levy. It dramatically increased in size from 365 million to 930 million, which, the median household jumped from $130 to $275. This also took a 3 sort of bucket approach, but instead of maintenance and transit and walking and biking, it had safe routes, which encompassed the newly adopted sort of Vision Zero and safety framework, as well as safe routes to school and some other projects. Congestion relief, which was really focused on transit mobility. This was a time in Seattle where, because the previous levy had been so focused on maintenance, people were really experiencing the growing pains. Seattle continued to be one of the fastest growing cities in the nation for years now. And because Bridging the Gap was so focused on maintenance and not focused on mobility, people were saying over and over again in polls and in the public that, just getting around Seattle was a major frustration. So the Move Seattle Levy pivoted and really talked about congestion relief and getting people around and sort of mobility. And there was also a bucket around maintenance and repair as well. One thing this levy did that I want to point out too, you don't know, we're going into a fall where the city is looking at cutting a bunch of funding because we're not expecting as much revenue to come in. And something that this levy and other levies usually do is they have, which is like a technical term, is like a non-supplementation clause. Basically, they say a certain amount of money needs to continue to be allocated for this issue, so that the levy doesn't just backfill it and then they take that money to do something else. And so in this case, it was $40 million. A little bit technical, but it's an important piece of it. Seattle Neighborhood Greenways was around for this levy, and we had a campaign called Move Seattle for Our Kids. We had been hearing a lot from community during our listening sessions and our outreach efforts that, safe routes to school was really fundamental and really important. And it also just felt like the right moral issue to take a stand on. We got a number of people involved, a bunch of different PTAs, the School Nurses Association for Public Schools, parents, teachers, equity groups, advocacy groups in the transportation space, all were saying we should really increase the amount of funding that's going for getting kids, safe sidewalks and crosswalks and trails to these schools. And the proposal was about $38 million. And one of the lessons we learned, though, was that even though we had built all of this public pressure, by the time we had launched this campaign, it was essentially too late, because the internal conversations that were being had were saying, we're really worried about voters not passing a levy the closer it gets to $1 billion. So we don't want to support even this really excellent proposal to increase funding for safe routes to school. So that was, it was a major disappointment, lesson learned. One of the things, though, that we found out was that, after we ran the campaign, and, a lot of you on the call probably helped out volunteering, we passed the Move Seattle Levy overwhelmingly with 59% of the vote. So the concerns that if we went too bold on a levy really didn't come to pass. And I think that's a lesson that we need to be taking forward as we're designing the next transportation levy. After it passed, the city slowly ramped up implementing projects. It didn't have, let me just go back to that slide first. It didn't have the capacity to immediately start delivering at such an expanded rate. Remember, this is a major jump over what Bridging the Gap was funding. And so that's another lesson learned, that we need to figure out how we can help the city hit the ground running and deliver these projects. Because every year we're delaying a project, the city's incurring costs, not only in the staff not being able to do the work, and just having to be paid to not do the work, but also in inflation, right? That if a lot of these projects were going to be being built, which Clara will talk about in a little bit later, we're being built at the end of the life of the levy, which means that they've taken years to come to fruition and incurred a bunch more costs. There's a bunch of other headwinds. The Trump administration came in and didn't provide as much of the federal grants that the city had expected. The levy is one piece of the pie. The city also has funding from other sources, like I mentioned, at the local level, and the state level, and the federal level. And because of the federal level really not coming through in a major way, a bunch of the bigger projects, including some of the rapid ride corridors that were proposed, didn't really pencil out. And another challenge was that when they originally scoped in the Move Seattle Levy, some folks feel that they weren't including as much cost as they needed to when they were being promised to voters. So when Mayor Durkin was elected and came in, she said, we need to really get our house in order and scale back what we're promising to voters. She paused or canceled or narrowed down a lot of projects. And of course, the public at the end of the day wants to see these projects built. And we do as well. And so there was a big public backlash to that, and the MASS coalition, the Move All Seattle Sustainably coalition, which is a bunch of environmental groups and transportation groups, came together at that time, and we worked with our community partners and allies to say, we need to be making major progress on keeping people safe, on getting people to where they need to go, on making good on our climate commitments as a city. And even though we have less funding available than we thought from the federal government, we need to do as much as possible to get these projects through. And so we worked with some of our allies on the city council. Councilmember Mike O'Brien was there, Councilmember Rob Johnson, Councilmember Mosqueda, and to try and restore as much of these cuts as possible with some success. And the next slide is for you, Claire. Or should I stop sharing?
Yeah, and I think we can drop the slides if we wanted to, so that I can see folks. So to share a little bit more about the Move Seattle Levy, it included some major big projects, from the bridge seismic projects, the Lander Street overpass over the railroad tracks in Soto, Fairview Bridge, also some really fantastic bike and pedestrian projects, the Northgate pedestrian bridge over I-5 connecting to the new light rail station. Some of the programs have done really well, and done a lot for our city. The Safe Routes to School program in particular is a very equity-focused, multi-pronged kind of approach to increasing safety for students who are walking and biking to school. The Neighborhood Street Fund also is community-identified projects with a really strong equity focus. Those smaller programs that aren't necessarily kind of the big cornerstone things of the levy can make a really big difference in individual people's lives and transportation habits for like a relatively small, like bang for your buck kind of exchange. There's also other programs that you might not necessarily associate with a transportation levy that are included, things like tree replacement, storm drainage partnerships, workforce development and diversity, programs that have been doing really great things for our city, but might not be immediately what you think of when you're thinking of transportation. But things like the tree replacement program replaces every tree that they remove with 2 new trees. And that's whether it's being removed because you're shifting the landscape a little bit or because of disease or other reasons. And it's made a big difference in our city. I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about the pedestrian transit and bike projects in the levy, since that's primarily what we focus on. And just start by saying pedestrian funding as a whole in Seattle is just like ridiculously, woefully inadequate, like so extremely inadequate. we did build some great things and make some strides with the Move Seattle Levy, but at Seattle's current funding levels, we won't have a completed sidewalk network for like 1,600 years. And that's not even taking into account fixing sidewalks. It's just filling in places where there aren't any. And some of those are like smaller neighborhood residential streets, but some of those are like major arterials, major business routes, major transit or business hubs, major transit routes. If you head up Aurora, North Aurora, one of the most popular bus routes in the entire country is up there, the E line. And if you go less than a quarter mile from some of those bus stops, the sidewalk disappears completely. And that kind of lack of infrastructure totally decreases the number of people who are able to access our transit networks, our business hubs. It makes it really difficult for people with disabilities, for elders, for kids, but like for everyone. It's also incredibly dangerous. There's a reason why Aurora Avenue is one of our most dangerous streets in Seattle. And so all that is to say, the next levy or the next funding package really needs to like dramatically shift our funding priorities in order to not just, to be the accessible city that we need Seattle to be, but also to like meet the established city plans that we have put in place, the established goals that we have about the number of miles of sidewalk that we want to complete and the number of transit routes that we want to be accessible. We are just like dramatically not meeting any of those things right now. And that's going to have to be a pretty intense shift in terms of the percentage of funding that goes towards those priorities. To say a little bit more about transit, in the Move Seattle Levy in particular, many of you are probably well aware because this was a big selling point of the levy, but they were called Transit Plus Multimodal Corridor Improvements is what they were called. Basically, rapid ride corridors are kind of like a halfway point in terms of the user experience between a bus and a train, where they're express buses that have fewer stops, go faster, and connect from downtown out to various points in the city. And the levy promised the completion of 7 of them. The idea was that we would have the transit improvements and also pedestrian and bike connections and improvements along the way as well to be kind of a multimodal corridor. Like Gordon was saying, many of those were scaled back in 2018 and just dropped completely. Those plans still exist, but they are not funded. Some of the corridors that were put in kind of scaled back a lot of the pedestrian and bike promises that they had. There's some of them that are still under construction right now. It's been kind of a mixed bag of results. The ones that have gone in, some of them are fantastic, but overall, it's been kind of a mixed bag of results. I think, many projects, particularly transit projects, do take a long time to implement, and we know that. So we're thinking of these levy windows of time in terms of what can we complete by the end of it, but also like what is partially completed now that has some of the design and outreach and engagement that we can kind of pick up and be completing within the first few years of the levy. So that's something to be considering as well. I also want to talk specifically about light rail. Light rail is not funded through the city's transportation levies. That's a separate Sound Transit funding bucket. But a lot of the connections to those light rail stations would be included and were included in the Move Seattle levy. So like I was talking about before, the Northgate pedestrian bridge, pedestrian and bike routes that connect to Mount Baker, to the U District, to Roosevelt, to South Graham Street, although those were canceled when the Graham Street station was pushed back. All of those things help to make our light rail accessible and usable and functional for people. And then another shift, talk a little bit about the bike projects. We did have a lot of bike projects that were completed in the Move Seattle Levy. Fantastic, amazing bike projects. The Downtown Basic Bike Network, you can now ride all the way into and through downtown on protected lanes, which didn't exist before. It makes downtown significantly more accessible for someone like me, which is amazing. Other projects around the city. As part of the levy, I think the original promises were 50 miles of new protected bike lanes and 60 miles of neighborhood greenways. And the goal was to complete half of the 2014 Bike Master Plan, which is a pretty ambitious goal. It's not a goal that we expect to meet at this point. There were a number of reasons the city was giving for not completing those numbers. Some of them are more understandable than others in terms of when this levy was passed. I think SDOT really didn't have a good idea of what real protection on bike lanes might cost, what it really cost to put in a bike lane that felt protected. So some of those things are understandable. Some of them I think are really just lack of political support, where we have bike lanes getting canceled or pushed to kind of really inefficient and ineffective sideways neighborhood greenways routes, bike lanes that kind of stop and start in their protection or stop completely through really narrow intersections. And the reality is in Seattle at this point right now, we have a tremendous amount of really fantastic bike infrastructure. Like it's actually a really large number that we have in Seattle in terms of mileage. But a lot of our bike routes don't connect to each other. You have these gaps, which means that there are places where you are in a really nice protected lane and it just sort of ends. And you're left like stuck in this really scary intersection and you don't really know where you're supposed to go. And what that means in terms of ridership is that the people who are able to bike comfortably in Seattle are still exclusively people who feel comfortable mixing with vehicle traffic, which is really limiting in terms of the number of people who feel comfortable doing that. And it's better in some neighborhoods than others, but I'm kind of generalizing for our whole city here. And until we start closing those gaps, we're not going to see the dramatic increase in bike ridership that our city goals have laid out for us. That being said, there are a significant number of really high-profile bike projects that will either be completed or starting construction this year or next year. That's the Martin Luther King Jr. Way from Judkins to Mount Baker. We'll be finishing the East Lake Avenue along with the Rapid Ride Corridor will be starting. They'll be doing work, a lot of work down in Georgetown and South Park. The Georgetown to South Park Trail, the Georgetown to Downtown Connection, East Marginal Way, the Beacon Avenue Northern section, the Alaskan Way Waterfront. It's just like a tremendous list of projects. And a lot of those were pushed from the beginning of the levy. And now the bike team at SDOT is sort of like scrambling to finish them before the end of the levy. I think some of those may end up getting a little bit more delayed. But if all of those are completed, I think we'd end up with like 85% of the original 110-mile goal, which is not terrible, although it's not all of the goal. And I do also just want to add another note before we move on from talking about the Move Seattle Levy is a lot of the goals that we're talking about here that were laid out in the Move Seattle Levy were kind of strict by the numbers goals. You know, we want to build X number of miles of bike routes. We want to build X number of blocks of sidewalks. We want to do X number of safe routes to school projects or Vision Zero projects. And one of the things that um, we've talked a little bit about, I also serve on the Levy Oversight Committee, which Gordon mentioned earlier. One of the things that has come up multiple times in that committee is, we may be meeting those goals. We may be building the miles that we've set for ourselves, delivering the number of Vision Zero projects that we laid out for ourselves. But when you look at the societal change that we hope those will accomplish, and in this instance, I'm talking specifically about Vision Zero, we haven't been accomplishing that. So Vision Zero is a goal that we set for ourselves in 2015 to have 0 people dying or being seriously injured in traffic crashes by 2030. And we have gone significantly backwards in that goal, where we have many more fatalities and serious injuries every year, and increasing every year than we did in 2015. And so we really need to kind of adjust ourselves as a city and look at that and say, we're meeting all of the goals that we set for ourselves in terms of the mileage, but we're not accomplishing the societal goal that we were striving for. And that's something that we need to address in this upcoming levy, whether it's setting new, better goals for ourselves, holding ourselves accountable to the intention of the project rather than just the mileage amount. When we're doing things like taking a protected bike lane off of an arterial and putting it onto a kind of out of the way or super hilly neighborhood greenway route, for example, there's a lot of folks for whom, like, you just can't afford to take the 45-minute bike route over the 20-minute one. And so you're still going to bike that dangerous arterial, even if there's not a bike lane there. And that's really dangerous, and people are still going to be seriously injured and losing their lives. And so we may be able to count that mileage towards our goal of like the number of bike lanes or the bike routes that we built, but it's not really helping us to achieve Vision Zero, if that makes sense. And part of that is also that, the projects that are often kind of the highest need, the things that would make the biggest difference and the most change, are sometimes politically challenging. And if we don't have elected leaders that are going to stand up for those projects, and they end up getting watered down or cut back or kind of delivered in ways that are not achieving their original goals, that's a problem. So that was a little bit of a tangent here. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening now. Right now, or over the last couple of years, I should say, there are kind of 3 parallel things happening within the city that are all very interconnected. One is the comprehensive plan update. One is the Seattle transportation plan, and the third is the transportation funding package. And in an ideal world, where all the city planning totally makes sense, we would be doing them in that order, where we would have the comprehensive plan, where we're talking about which areas we're going to be increasing housing density, where our business hubs are, what our zoning is going to look like. And then we would set a transportation plan on top of that in order to serve that goal city. And then we would set a transportation funding package that would fund whatever we put in the Seattle transportation plan. Unfortunately, because we're not doing it in that order. The comprehensive plan has been delayed and is not really expected until later this year. The Seattle transportation plan that SDOT has been working on for the last couple of years is going to be coming out to City Council within the next month or so. It's kind of in the tail end of its finalizing process. And if you've been engaged with SNG over the course of the last 2 years, you know that we've been really heavily involved in advocating for a transportation plan that really does meet our values and goals as a city. But the timeline is a little bit off because the transportation levy is expiring this year. And if you count back from the November ballot, there's a certain amount of time that they have to go through council and do community engagement and all of that. And so the Seattle transportation funding package is going to be coming out kind of almost simultaneously with the Seattle transportation plan. And it's really confusing and really obnoxious and just kind of a horrible way to go about doing things. So SDOT is currently drafting their transportation funding package. It'll be released in likely late February, so we have about a month or so. There will be about 4 weeks of public comment opportunities, and then SDOT will kind of take it back in and work to incorporate that public feedback. And then they're going to send another draft to council in April. And council will have an opportunity to comment on it, and advocates on the outside will have an opportunity to encourage council members to implement the changes that they want. And then council will vote on a package which includes whatever amendments they've made, and hopefully approve it in the summer in order to go to the ballot in November, where the general population of Seattle will vote on it. Thus far, we don't have, we haven't seen a draft, so we don't know the details of what's in it. But we have been part of the conversations with the city leading up to it. And thus far, we're hearing about a kind of unambitious transportation levy proposal with a heavy focus on maintenance and kind of maintaining the status quo, kind of a systems as is levy. And we've been pushing back really dramatically and saying that our transportation system, like, we really just can't keep the course. We can't keep the status quo with this. Doing a maintenance only and a kind of systems as is levy is absolutely not what we need. And our city is what we need today. And our city is growing. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the country right now. And if we're talking about a 10-year, 9-year, 8-year span, it's definitely not what we need for another 8 years. If we don't make any progress on any of our safety or climate or equity goals from now for the next 8 years, that would be pretty disastrous. Right now, we're especially concerned about the bike program, since we've been hearing from the mayor's office over the years, pushing hard and against bike lanes on arterials and using language about neighborhood connections and pushing bike routes onto the neighborhood greenways on the side. Like I was saying before, we love neighborhood greenways, but the city doesn't have a track record of doing them well and doing them in a way that feels safe. And they also just aren't feasible in many locations where you have really dramatic hills or valleys or bridges that make the geography such that you just don't have an alternative route like that. So all of that is to say, we are very concerned about this. We've been working with a work group led by Disability Rights Washington, and a pretty wide coalition of advocates to push the city for a better package. And the next month or two is going to be extremely important in terms of that timeline and getting the city to a levy that we can actually support and throw our weight behind. Right now, we are planning a big rally and show of support in late February, timed with one of the city council meetings where they'll be talking about transportation. We don't know exactly what that date is yet, but if you stay tuned, we would love your support for that. We're also anticipating a pretty big push to turn people out to some of those public engagement opportunities, to city council meetings, to send in emails about their transportation priorities to council. And all of that is coming up in the next month or two. If you RSVP'd for this session tonight, we have your email address and would love to add you to that list to hear about those upcoming things. If you heard about this from a forwarded email from a friend, feel free to drop your email in the chat. You can do it just as a message to myself or Gordon if you would prefer to not have it public. But we'd love to have you as a part of that. I am seeing now that it's 6:15 and I want to have some time for questions and answers here at the end. So I'll pause there and we'll jump into question and answers and then do a little closing wrap up at the end. So I know that was a lot of information we just spewed at you very rapidly. If anyone has questions or things you'd like to hear more about, please jump. Robin, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I've got a question about the climate aspects of the transportation plan. I'm totally down with all the other goals, but I kind of tend to focus on climate first. And the city has a goal of reducing emissions from transportation by 83% compared to 2008 by 2030. And this transportation levy is like the last chance, I think, for any like major investment that would assist with that. And I'm just wondering whether in your discussions with the city, have they talked about that at all?
Yes, that is true. And I think that the city is made nervous by those goals being brought up because they are not on track to meet them, and this plan will not get them there. In addition to those kind of overarching citywide goals for emissions, I mean, well, just to say off the top, transportation is like far and away the biggest source of emissions in Seattle, like far and away. And so this plan and this process really is like the thing that Seattle has to tackle in order to meet our climate goals. We're making progress in a lot of other places, and in transportation, we struggle. In addition to the big kind of overarching goals, Seattle also just released a climate change response framework kind of late end of last year, which sets really specific goals for transportation in terms of the percentage of trips that they want to be taken by bike and walking and rolling and by transit. I think it's like 7% of trips by bike by 2030, 24% walking and rolling. I don't remember the transit one, maybe about 25% by transit, and then another section by electric private cars. And it was only like 30, 35% or fewer trips taken by non-electric private cars, which is like wonderful. And I'm really grateful for the city for setting those goals. But like the plans that they're putting out since then are not what's going to get us there. So yes, that's worrying. I think that those are the types of things sometimes that are easy for politicians to kind of push off to the next administration. And then you get politicians that come into office and say, oh, well, we haven't been making progress on that. So like, I'm going to continue not making progress and it doesn't really matter, which is really unfortunate. And that's where we as advocates have a role to play in really pushing back and holding the city accountable to the things that they've promised us.
Yeah, I think it would be great to get publicity on that. Thank you.
Yeah. If you're interested in helping out with that, we always need more people.
I'm definitely interested.
Kind of beating that drum. I'm seeing some conversation in the chat. From Scott, how specific can we be in advocating for location-specific projects, or will this be more about categories and project themes? I think that's really important. This is maybe just me with my like pessimist hat on, but I think the more specific projects that are listed in something like a levy proposal, the more excited people get. Because when you hear, you know, X number of miles of protected bike lanes or X number of miles of street repaving, that doesn't really mean anything to most people. But if you see like, oh, they're going to build a bike route that I would use, or like they're going to improve this transit corridor and make it faster and easier for me to get downtown by taking that bus route that I use every day. They're going to, you know, put in a new pedestrian crossing here where I cross to get to my local business district. Those are the kinds of things that people get excited about and that makes people want to turn out and vote yes for something. And go door knocking in support of a project like that. And I think conversely, the mayor's office at this point has a lot of really kind of flowery words, a lot of really nice goals and ambitions without a lot of accountability attached to the bottom. And the fewer specific projects they can list, or the fewer specifics they can list about a project, the easier it is for them to kind of checkbox it without actually accomplishing the goal of the project. So when I say that, I mean like you can have a project like safety for Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, right? And it's like one of the most dangerous streets in Seattle. It's horrendous to travel down by just about any mode that you're traveling down. There's a train down the middle of it that really regularly kills people. It's really difficult to cross as a pedestrian. There's no bike routes. It's like kind of a mess. And so SDOT can have an item in the levy that says, safety project for MLK. But unless we have like what their goals are for that project, or what they're going to be including for that project, or what that project means to them, it's hard to hold them accountable to doing anything about it, if that makes sense. And I think that right now, a lot of the projects that SDOT is talking about are still in that very early design phase or less, where it's just kind of a conceptual phase, where they don't have those details. And it's really hard to really put pins into that and say, these are the things that we need to do, if they're kind of promising a little bit of everything for everyone. So to Scott, I would say we do need to be advocating for specific projects, and not just specific projects, but specific things that we want to see in those projects too. And the more specific we can be, I think the better the outcome. I'm seeing a number of comments in the chat, and I am not going to get through those. If we have a council which isn't supportive of the right protected bike and pedestrian investments, and the levy isn't ambitious enough beyond maintenance, would SNG advocate against the levy? Yeah. And it's something that's happened in the past before in Seattle, where advocates came out really hard against a transportation levy that wasn't funding the priorities they wanted to see, and came back a year later with an improved one. I think a no campaign is a very real possibility. We've also been talking within the advocates work group about other possible alternatives that we're still kind of scoping in terms of like potentially running our own kind of levy campaign or something to that effect. And those kinds of campaigns are challenging. They're expensive. They're not what anyone wants to be doing with our time and energy and money. We would rather the city put forth a package that we can get behind and really support, and we wouldn't have to do all that work. But if their package comes out and it's terrible, that's our role as advocates. I'm seeing some more comments here. Is planning for capital projects an acceptable project, or does everything the list need to result in some kind of construction? That's a really good question, Scott. And I think that it kind of opens up a little bit of a can of worms in terms of transportation funding, where a lot of the big capital projects that we do as a city are funded a little bit from the levy and funded a little bit from local sources, but we also receive a fair amount of money from state and federal grants and other kinds of like matching partnership opportunities that the city has. And when you're talking about an 8-year span of time, we don't know what grants and partnership opportunities might exist or we might be awarded. And so there's always a little bit of a question mark there, where the city is in a much better position to apply for and receive grants if they have a project scoped and designed and kind of much more prepared and further along the process. even if we don't necessarily have funding within the levy for construction. And a lot of those projects, SDOT will do that design and planning in anticipation of then applying for a state or federal grant. Like Gordon was saying about the Move Seattle levy, I think in previous levy, we kind of overestimated what that would be pretty significantly, and ended up with a lot of promises to voters that weren't completed. And so in this levy, the mayor's office is being really, really conservative with some of those estimates and not promising very much at all, which is kind of swinging back in the other direction, I feel a little bit. But it is a part of the process where some of the projects that are included will be kind of funded for design and for community engagement and things like that without having the full funding for construction included. And that's kind of normal. Ideally, we would have at least a couple of kind of big signature projects that are like the city's able to put a pin in and say, we're going to do this regardless of whether we get grant funding that we're anticipating or not. And if we end up not getting grant funding, you know, we'll have to reshuffle some of the other priorities. But having those things that you can really say, like, this is a priority for us and it's important, and this is something that we really want to do for the betterment of our city is really important for voters. Does that answer that question? Awesome. We might have time for one more question if folks have. So would we need to include an item for applying for available grants to fund construction so that they can't make a political decision to just not apply for construction grants? I mean, I think that on the scale of something like the transportation levy, which is, you know, the amounts that they're looking at are 1.2 to 1.7 billion. We're anticipating that there will be state and federal funding that will match some of those projects. What we don't know is like exactly how much or where exactly that funding will be directed. But I think it's kind of a normal process for SDOT to be applying to grants all the time every year. And there are certain projects that kind of, for lack of a better word, like kind of look better on grant proposals than others. It tends to be more like bigger signature projects that have kind of a tangible, like countable improvement, as opposed to like, we want to fund our Safe Routes to School program, which will build, you know, 9 to 12 Safe Routes to School projects per year, as an example. So SDOT will be applying for those. And there are political decisions that can interact with that. Sometimes we'll even win funding for a project and then it'll get canceled or downgraded anyway, and we'll just lose that money. But yeah, I don't know if I have a kind of comprehensive answer for that. Yeah, the streetcar example that Ben just put in the chat. All right. So I want to make sure that we have a little bit of a couple minutes here for closing. If you, again, I will just put a shout out. If you're on our emailing list, you'll hear about some of the upcoming things that we don't necessarily have dates for in terms of this advocacy, because it really depends on when the city releases their draft plans. If you are not on those lists, please drop your email, or you can email myself or Gordon. I'm Clara, CLARA, at seattlegreenways.org. And you'll be hearing from us probably several times over the course of the next month and a half or two. If you are interested in coming a little bit closer and being involved in one of our advocacy work groups, we would love to have more folks there as well. We also have a couple of upcoming events that we'd love to see you at. Tomorrow evening, I'm working with the Seattle Solidarity Budget folks to host a skills building workshop on budget analysis. It's tomorrow at 6 o'clock, I believe. And I could put that in the chat here. And then we have a Seattle Neighborhood Greenways volunteer happy hour coming up on Friday, February 9th that we'd love to see you at Stoop Brewery in Capitol Hill. And that's just a very casual opportunity to just come and meet some of the staff, meet some of the group leaders, hang out with old friends you haven't seen in a while, meet some new faces. And probably people will be talking shop a lot there too. Thank you so much for coming here and spending an hour with us on your Tuesday evening. And we hope to see you again soon.